All right. So we are here with Dr. Jeff Rothstein, who is a DVM MBA, and he is the founder and co-president of Missionary Veterinary Partners, which operates over 320 clinics in 35 states. So certainly staying busy from that standpoint. Dr. Rothstein has written over 100 articles for various different practice management publications and has a lot of accolades. His bio is way too long for me to read because it could be probably about half a podcast itself. So you've done a lot of great stuff. And I just want to say thanks for spending some time and coming on to the show.
Thanks. I am happy to be here.
Yeah. And we were fortunate enough. We did a pre-call. We got to meet at VMX. So I think this will make the podcast interview and the experience even better since we've gotten to chat a little bit in person as well and get to know each other. And you were recently on a number of other podcasts, one of them being with some friends of the show, the VFS show, basically with Meredith and Willie. And I know that when we kind of chatted, it's like you've done a lot of your history and background and covered a lot of kind of where you've come from, the design of your career, a lot of that stuff. So for those that are interested and, listen to this episode and you're like, hey, I want more of that background stuff, definitely check out some of the other episodes. I'll link to those in the show notes. But I really wanted to just kind of dive in and get into some of the insights and knowledge that you have and have shared with others and start from there. So one thing that you mentioned in our pre-call that I really, really liked was this idea of wage-flation. And I wanted to kind of kick it off there. And, what is it? Why does it matter? And how is it, impactful in veterinary medicine?
Sure. And thanks for giving my intro and bio. And I like to just say, I have a lot of my own philosophies and theories. And so obviously I'm very associated with MVP, but I kind of, speak on my own and not for the whole organization. For our profession, when I started out a few moons ago, I remember our dean of our veterinary school, James Voss, came in and said, first day, there will always be room for another good veterinarian. And we had a real surplus of veterinarians. And it's always a little bit, you get these Pew reports and they say the projections for the future and so on. So I don't know, it's never seemed that easy to, find veterinarians to hire, even maybe back at that time. But I think what's changed a lot here is certainly on the surface, there is an undersupply of veterinarians. So the demand is very large for veterinarians and veterinary services. And even I think with the proliferation of groups of clinics and so on, and the demand, you're seeing quite a few new clinics open as well. So the de novo model by groups and by individuals is there, sort of prompted by COVID. So all that comes together to create a scenario where wages are going up more than I think in other industries and more than historically for the veterinary community. On top of that, of course, is part of it having to do with the excessive debt that veterinary students have. So not only do you have the normal inflation, and certainly we're seeing our vendors in the profession behave like most vendors out of necessity, increasing their prices, and maybe what was typically 3, 4, 5%, all of a sudden becomes a 6, 7, 8%. So you have kind of a double whammy, and it's more than just the inflation. So I say that wage-flation is pretty dramatic, and that it throws some complications into the whole industry.
For sure. And you mentioned the idea of the surplus, the surplus or shortage of veterinarians, and how it was obviously very different then than it is now, where there's talk of there's not enough veterinarians. We need more schools. We need to get more veterinarians through school to meet all this demand. And when we chatted, one of my favorite questions I always ask, and you're like, I don't know if this is a non-consensus view or not, but you mentioned that actually might be more of a positive than a negative. Do you want to kind of highlight that and expand on it? Because I think a lot of people look at the shortage in veterinarians out there as a major, headwind in this big struggle where you're like, maybe it's not?
Sure. Um, as you said, just in front of us, it seems like a huge hurdle, and complicates things in a lot of different ways, even access to care for pets and clients. If I go back again to my days of school, and my MBA thesis was on the supply and demand of veterinary services, and I basically said there, if you have 50,000 veterinarians splitting $5 billion in revenue, you're going to be locked into $100,000 compensation. So if you took that number, and maybe we'll say 100,000 veterinarians and $20 billion of revenue, would equate to a $200,000 salary. So some of it to me is just kind of simple math. We're splitting the pie of revenue between more or less veterinarians. And so I think while it's painful, I think we want to use this time to become more efficient and make sure that we have the revenue to support the compensation that veterinarians need. And a lot of that then prompts you to say, okay, what are things that we can do to improve our efficiency, be it utilizing staff better? Is it creating a mid-level practitioner position? Is it leveraging our new PIM system? So all these different things that can allow us to be more efficient. As opposed to just saying, all right, let's create a scenario where, we just have a lot of veterinarians again, and then we get stuck in a low compensation scenario. And being a lifelong, passionate person for the profession, I really want to see us break out of, what's been a difficult economic scenario for most veterinarians.
Yeah. And I mean, the idea, and there's a really great book that I think I've mentioned on this podcast before, written by Jeff Booth, but it talks about how technology is deflationary, right? And so like with technology, we should be able to do more with less. And so the idea of using the same numbers of how many veterinarians were needed in, the early 2000s or the 90s or the 80s, it just doesn't necessarily make sense, because we should be able to get more efficient from the standpoint of leveraging the team, or, like you said, technology, the PIMS, other areas to make yourself more efficient. Now, at the same case, right, there's the forever struggle, right, of burnout and people wanting to leave the profession. And again, I think in any profession, you're going to have burnout. And within veterinary medicine, like, I think that gets exacerbated. And it's not just from the veterinary staff, like it's all the way, through the techs, CSRs, all of that, where there's some, financial challenges and struggles there. So to your point earlier, you have to have the revenue brought in by the profession to be able to pay everyone a living wage, not just the DVM, but all the way down through the team. And I think there was an interesting question recently that came up, and I wanted to get kind of your thoughts and opinions and take on it, because it's this idea of, how do you think about profit sharing in veterinary medicine versus equity in the business for employees? And maybe this is beyond just the key employees like the DVMs. And then what are the big differences, and what have you seen successful? I mean, you had your private practice a while ago. Obviously, MVP has some things going on. Do you have any thoughts on the idea between, profit sharing, which is, hey, we're going to split the pie, versus actually equity within, a hospital or a group of hospitals?
Sure. Going back to just kind of the rudimentary, reward systems and bonuses, I think they have their place. I found that you need to change those up, or they're not necessarily that motivating. So the staff are interesting, I think, in terms of what's important to them. But ultimately, some form of higher compensation is significant, and probably more important than bonuses and rewards is just flat out higher compensation. So creating an environment where we can share, more of that pie is significant. So profit sharing certainly, can be substantial. And so I think that's one area that we can focus on more. There are groups like ours that allow some equity ownership. And so I think that is significant. And ultimately, when you do have a larger group of practices, you have that potential of being a little more efficient in terms of cost structure and so on. And so being able to share more with the team has its potential. But I think different forms of ownership, you know, are significant. And there are groups like ours that will say that we are employee owned because a lot of people, you know, own a share of the pie. And so some of it may be, you know, what are you taking home today in terms of possibly profit share or bonus? But some may be, do you gain value with some ownership in the company? And at some point, are you rewarded for that? And I think those models are going to be important. And I think, as you know, I certainly deal with a lot of my solo or independent veterinary friends that own their hospitals, and how do you compete with the groups and so on. I think those structures are there too to, you know, either put in place good profit sharing or also be innovative and, you know, allow a certain percentage of ownership. So I think it's, you know, just being innovative. And at the end of the day, I think you've got to really look at financial planning and does it add up? You know, is it a viable career? And it's a challenge, obviously, as you said, for some of the sports support staff. But again, I think if we're working hard at making hospitals, and I do a presentation on, you know, on profitability and how significant that is now and in the future, not just for the owner, but for the team, and all the stakeholders, you know, your clientele and the community and so on. So I think that focus on the bottom line sometimes is overlooked, and what you can do with that and how significant that is. You may be comfortable with your compensation as an owner, but if you paid more attention to it and were able to pass on more profits to the team, that would be significant.
Yeah, and I think it's from my first mentor. So when I graduated college and started work at 22, 23, I was fortunate to have an awesome mentor who was successful at running businesses. He was, 67, had tons of energy, but he always threw out this term called swipe, which is steal with integrity and pride. So if you see a good idea, you should go swipe it. So if I'm a private practice owner and I look out into the world of, corporate consolidators, and obviously there's a wide range of those that I think do a really good job and execute really well and have grown because of that, and others that are there and are just large and they're successful in spite of themselves. And then there's obviously a mix in between, right? And so we don't need to necessarily try to get you, Jeff, in trouble to say, hey, which ones are which, right? From that standpoint. But if you see something as a private practice owner or even another, corporate entity in your, in leadership, it's like, okay, let's borrow these other ideas. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. So if this helps, and you also have to know your team, because you talked about that, historically, maybe it's they just want compensation higher. Maybe they want more time off. Maybe they need more flexibility. So maybe you think the profit sharing idea is great, and the team's like, yeah, I don't want that really. I want this other thing. So like have the conversation and then build it from there as far as what you're trying to accomplish. But I personally like the idea of everyone having some skin in the game for their compensation to say, these are the big team goals. And if we move and do well together and it's not pitting front versus back or this other stuff, we all get to share that. And another interesting thing that I think we've chatted on, offline and kind of in a pre-call was the idea of mentorship and helping kind of younger DVMs get up to speed and get to where they can produce at a higher level and be comfortable and not feel like they're following or falling behind or floundering. And I think that also then still ties back, if you're doing some sort of profit sharing, that incentivizes the rest of the team or the older veterinarians maybe that are there to help them so that you can be more efficient and see some of those other things come through. But can you talk a little bit about what you've seen, maybe from MVP, maybe just from your own experiences as a practice owner with mentoring younger veterinarians and getting them comfortable to say yes and feel confident in their abilities, and how that's, benefited the organization or others?
Yeah. And before I answer, I just want to say, with some of your commentary, fresh eyes from outside the profession are so impactful, and observations like yours, because sometimes we get in a rabbit hole or get narrow vision and lose sight of things that work for other professions. And so, in terms of the mentoring, I think it's the most significant piece right now. It's something that young graduates, recent graduates, are super interested in, but it's a two-way street. We need our new graduates to become productive pretty darn quickly. One, to justify the compensation that they demand right now. And so the interesting thing is you quickly can see a new graduate within a year sometimes be as productive as someone that's been out 5 or 10 or 15 years. It used to be back in the day when I was owned a practice or two, and I had my buddies and colleagues that owned the practices, where in some ways we, especially if you're a smaller practice, you shunned away from the new graduate because it was, a big effort to get them up to speed, and you didn't always feel like you were getting a bang for the buck, and they left you in a year or two. Now I think there's so much focus on picking up where the schools leave off, and the schools can't, be the end all. Sometimes we say they do a lousy job of, training them for the real world. That model's changed a little bit with some of the newer schools that really use the practices to do a lot of the clinical training. But you can, within a year or two, really get up to speed very quickly. So I think, you don't want to have worked really hard in vet school for 4 years and you're not doing the internship thing and then want to go on easy street. I mean, there's a lot of, newer grads historically that shy away from surgery and so on. The reason they do, they haven't had somebody, really mentor and train them in that, first year or two. And I think it's like anything, learning to swim, learning to ski, you do it when you're young and you almost don't even think about it. So, if you're doing foreign body removals, cystotomies, and some fairly involved surgeries at a young time frame out of school, those can become pretty second nature, and those are really important skills. I mean, a lot of hospitals end up turning away a lot of medicine and profitable surgery because they don't have a competent staff to do those. Whereas if you learn that right out the gate, those are not, particularly things that need to go to specialty practice. And by the same token, the confidence of those, individuals and their gratification, and a lot of times the stress level, so you get 2 doctors on at a hospital and an emergency comes in, and you're not comfortable doing that, pyometra surgery, then either it's taking a real long time or you don't do it. And so I think it really impacts just your general confidence level, just like that basketball player that hits that first, 3-point shot or something. When you really feel good about it and you feel like you can do everything, you're going to be a lot more productive. And so I think mentoring is really significant. I think a lot of the groups do a great job with it, have a lot of emphasis on it, and no reason that independent, practices can as well. I think you just need structure and goals, and we've seen the dividends of that, just the satisfaction. And then what it does is it frees you up, whatever it is, 3 to 5 years out, out of school, to really look at, okay, are there some other things that I want to do? Can I be the medical director of a hospital, or can I oversee 5 or 10 hospitals, or can I go and own my own hospital? So I think that is extremely critical and has been, a missing link up until maybe these last 5 years, where there's been a lot more focus on it.
Do you think it's more that younger grads are afraid to fail, or is it more on the current either leadership within that hospital, whether it's corporate or private, that isn't giving them a lot of ability to succeed.
Yeah. Again, I don't want to put myself in the senior veterinary category because a lot of my, baby boomer buddies that own practices, and excuse my
You're fine.
golden doodle.
I only jumped a little bit because I wasn't looking, and it just barked. I was like, "Oh man!" And
she's looking at some deer outside the door or something. So I think part of it is the much more a focus on malpractice liability type things where people just are a little more afraid of going out on a limb and trying things. And so, again, if you can have some emphasis on some of the basic surgeries, be it spay, neuter, and how to do that proficiently, that can make a big difference. Whether that's a 40-minute procedure or a 25-minute procedure, and then it's just that whole confidence. Then you're ready to move on to some more complicated procedures. Hold on one. I was going to go shut that door. So it does make I think a big difference when you're shown, and a lot of times it's like a picture's worth 1,000 words. Sometimes it's this basic stuff, the type of knot or incision. You can read all the books you want, but until you see it sometimes. And so having that ability to get mentored by someone that's specifically good at doing procedures, and it's not just the surgery type things. A lot of that is also going to be exam room communications and writing your medical notes, and those things make a big difference. How do you work efficiently within the hospital, so that again obviously time does equate to money too. So you don't want to think about I got to see 18 or 20 clients in a day, but being able to see that extra patient or two does make a big difference for the team. And we get into this culture where I'd say the front desk becomes a little bit of a gatekeeper based on a doctor's stress level.
Sure.
So all those factors make a difference, and sometimes it's even seconds. Banfield, quite a few years ago, did time and motion studies, and had a cycle of service. And when you really look at these things, ultimately, it seems like, wow, do we have to be that focused on on the time frame of things? Ultimately, it's like anything else. Being a great basketball player or tennis player, practice and little maneuvers make a really big difference. And so, you don't want to be hyper focused on those things, but when that can become part of the culture in a positive way, it can have really, really, big difference for a hospital in terms of even client satisfaction. Is everybody waiting, 20 minutes because you're, spending the time on the phone calling back, blood results when, your, technology now will allow those results to be, sent right to the client. So then looking for all those little ways of saving seconds. And that's a, administration part of it. But if we're all working together, those things can make a difference. And I just had that conversation with a running buddy of mine who's a urologist, and it was the same type of environment sometimes that people might say you might get. It could be corporate independent. Banfield was, got some flack on, hey, you got to see whatever it is, 18 or 20 clients a day back in the time. I see that in human medicine the same, and the struggles that, my friend has in terms of Now with the portals and emailing, it's like, I go home at night and I'm emailing clients back to 11 o'clock at night just so I can, stay ahead of the game.
Sure.
So it's not unique to this profession.
Yeah. And I think what you just said there at the end is sometimes there are other professions that are struggling the same way. And it's not, again, hyper focused on just this is a vet med issue. This is just a changing of client expectations or patient expectations in lots of different businesses. And like, how do you better adapt and leverage that? And it's either a great opportunity or it's going to be a huge stressor. And so it's like, okay, if you were to be the one waiting out there, like when we go to the dentist or we go, to go to our, MD for whatever, when you're waiting in the patient room for a long time, you're like, my appointment was what? Are you a happy person? The answer is no, right? Like you're busy, you have time. So think of that with everyone else. And it's like, how can you make that experience better? And sometimes it's little things and stuff happens, right? It's not going to be perfect every day. And you just have to continue to try to get better. But going back to what you talked about, like that's from a leadership perspective where, as a private practice owner, you can be a great doctor, poor leader. And I think that's something that, again, is not necessarily just a veterinary medicine thing. I saw that in my first job, going back to my mentor. What happened is the best outside salesperson in the business that I was at got promoted to the national sales director. And you know what? Great sales guy, horrible manager. And it was very apparent from day one that was not a good decision because you took the person that was best at that role and you moved them into a position where that's not naturally the gifts that he was given. And he struggled. And so it's the same way of trying to get the right people in the right seats. And I mean, that's the GE Jack Welch type thing from a long time ago for anyone that likes business stuff, of finding the right people and putting them in the right position, because the A player in, XYZ scenario could be the person that's going to flounder anywhere else. And that is a challenge, and it's an ongoing challenge. You talked about profitability. I want to ask a little bit about that because there's this, and I'm going back, it's probably I don't know when they released it in Vet Partners, but I think I saw it in 2019 of kind of the no-low practice in this, single doctor, there's revenue coming in the door. There's a patient base there, but it's not really saleable. It's not really profitable. It's kind of more of like, it's not really a business. It's kind of like you're just the doctor and you show up and there's no one else to tell you what to do. But how do you think about the opportunity there, and how do you view driving more profitability in just hospitals in general that maybe are limited from a staff perspective or only have one doctor? Because like there's no magic like spell that you can just be like, oh, yep, you just do this, and all of a sudden you're just way more profitable and everyone wants to acquire you. But I mean, if you had to give a couple, maybe baby steps, what would you encourage?
Great question. I just got a lengthy letter from a doctor who is retirement age, and basically it's like, it's my fate that I'm not going to be able to sell my practice like a lot of my buddies. I kind of have lived in a world where, in terms of buying practices, you almost think like, gosh, every practice is, worth a lot of money. What you have to realize, just like our population, 15-20% of the population is, okay financially, and the rest not so much. I think that's, where we are with practices. And so there's certainly a significant amount of practices that still, whether it's a third of them or so, that are that, one doctor, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 practice. And I think it depends where you catch those practices. If it's been that way for 30 years, is it based on a demographic? Is it based on the doctor? And I talk about an it practice. How do you have, and I had a real life example of this, a $5 million practice on one side of town, and then, not far away, another one of these, more classic, one doctor, $400,000, practices. What, because it would seem like, wow, that person would be able to give great customer service, and the other place has got 8 or 10 doctors, and but sometimes a place just has develops a reputation, and it could be based on quality of care, the ability to get people in, the price, all those different factors that make one place, popular, and also just the ability. And we talked about the mentoring. Okay, one place is doing pyometras and cystotomies and foreign bodies, and the other one's sending them all to emergency. Well, people don't love getting sent to emergency for all things. So I think it really depends on a lot of factors, but is it, if you take that $300,000 practice and put a hungry veterinarian or a talented veterinarian, that can do it all into that location, will it take off and will it grow? And there's a lot of them where I think, you may pick up a sleeper practice and really be able to grow that practice. So you have to look at each one individually. Some of these ones that are a little more rural can be a little more of a challenge. Certainly, what I've seen in some rural areas is, again, there's this IT practice, and they're phenomenal. They, either they had extended hours or whatever they did, they got the 4 or 5 doctors, and in most places, and it's a little more challenging economically in some rural areas, but a lot of these practices can be multi-million-dollar practices that people come from all over. And so it's, you can in some ways poo-poo some of the rural practices and put them into, a less saleable situation. But it is, I think there's almost always one place in many parts of these areas that, really excel and have very valuable practices that sometimes blow your mind a little bit. Mm-hmm. So again, I think there are going to be a lot of practices that probably aren't going to find, necessarily that buyer. And, I'd say more recent graduates are a little less interested in the rural lifestyle. But obviously those practices aren't just rural. There's plenty of, one doctor practices. And I think there's a sweet spot too. If I'm looking at, hey, I've been out 5-10 years, and I'm at a stage where I want to do my own thing, or I want to be an owner. I mean, there's a lot of different routes for that, but let's say it is outside of partnering with a group or so on. Those can be really great if you can get into, $700,000 to $1 million practice. You're at least earning your salary if you take your 20% production. So you're not just hopefully buying a job, but then if you can build that up. And I do a lot of presentations on taking a practice to that next level. I have a couple of colleagues that have opened their own places recently, and within just 2-3 years, those can be multi-doctor, multi-million-dollar practices. And again, I always say for someone that's, how does an independent compete with a group? I mean, you can get great customer service, in any of those places, but, if you're that hungry, new owner, and you're not turning anybody away, and you've got the skill set to, keep most things in-house, very quickly you can build those practices. And that's, there was so much demand during COVID, being in the right place, has been, a good time for a lot of people. And so some starting it, and then I have another buddy that took over. It's a second practice for him. It's in a large practice, and a friend wanted to retire and had, probably again a $400,000 or $500,000 practice, little older style of practice, and within a year or so, that practice is, 2 doctor and over $1 million. And I have a little model that kind of shows like the value paradigm of practices. And when you hit a certain threshold, the value just goes up exponentially. And so those opportunities are out there for sure. I think you just have to be a little prudent if you are purchasing a practice like that in terms of what the potential is. But sometimes you get a great buy, and people are thrilled to have some new energy and skill set in there. So I think it's good opportunities out there.
Totally. And I was going to ask you your thoughts, because I've obviously had lots of conversations both on this podcast and offline with folks that will have very different opinions on the success or the sustainability or the viability of private practice. But I think you kind of answered that. I did want to ask one question on the kind of, if you can share or can kind of touch on and expand a little bit on that value threshold that you talked about with the exponential growth, kind of where that spot is, where it changes, because there's lots of it, like even in the registered investment advisory space. So like what my day job is when I'm not recording podcasts, right? So in the RIA space, there is, a spot where you grow as a business to a certain spot. And there's a lot of private equity or other buyers in that space where it's like, oh, the multiples or what they will pay for that business drastically changes. Oh, and by the way, the like revenue and all that stuff is much higher. But then you get like the people that own those businesses, it's kind of wild what it changes and where that threshold is. Now it's in my space, it's pretty big. It's pretty big. So we got a ways to go from our team to ever get in that conversation. But yeah, I'm just curious on the value threshold, what you've seen or what you would kind of touch on there.
Sure. So I would say over time, there was a time when groups were buying, practices that might be, one or two doctor, million two. I think what has been discovered is that those can be tricky practices if, you can count the number of reasons why, you can lose a doctor, right? I mean, it can be anything from maternity leave, illness, people move. So there is a big risk factor when you buy a smaller practice. And a joint venture maybe is a little bit different, and so that can be viable. But when the sweet spot in a lot of ways, I think is, 3 doctors, not bad, 4 doctors, even better. Just in terms of, again, staffing a hospital. And then revenue wise, almost under 2 million now is, not as desirable. And that's not, I mean, look, there's a lot of different buyers out there, so I can't say that for everybody. But, a sweet spot is going to certainly be close to 2 million with, 3-4 doctors. Gives you some sustainability in that practice. Now you have to throw in other factors. Some of that can involve the facility. What you'll see is right now, because let's say this last 5 to 7 years, a lot of buying going on. And those 5-year leases, first term 5-year lease is up, and a lot of practices, or group owned might be, we've grown the practice. We also have to staff the practice, and a state-of-the-art facility is pretty significant today. And so I don't think you can underestimate the value of a nice facility in terms of wanting a sure sale. I was always I like cheap real estate because it definitely helped the margins. But when I look at doctors that have really invested in their facilities and been able to grow into them, it's typically been a really wise investment. And it just, if someone's buying that practice and then they got to go put $400,000 or $500,000 into the facility, it's a lot of time and effort. It's a lot of money, and a lot of times is, can we even add 2 exam rooms? So, I mean, anyone buying a practice wants to grow it. Anybody buying a practice wants to be able to staff it with the best people. And most doctors now, they're not interested in working in, a house that's converted into a practice. Yep. So significant, a strong practice management or practice manager can be a big draw also. Not that you can't potentially, find or locate a practice manager. Sometimes it says something about the culture and the leadership of that doctor that they're able to hand things off to somebody. So I'd say, that can be significant. So a lot of little factors, the demographics, can come into play as well. Things like accounts receivable. But I'd say the biggest thing is probably your top three is going to be number of doctors, revenue, and that facility. And so in that paradigm, it's crazy. Like I said, you could purchase, that $1 million practice, and maybe it's run by one doctor. Get in there, whatever it is, fix up the clinic a little bit, and just manage it a little bit different, or maybe you're offering a lot more services. And within a year or two, if you can bump that, up to, $1.2 million, $1.5 million, $2 million, add a doctor or two, and it's a totally, what you bought maybe for, a really good, good price, all of a sudden can be worth, a heck of a lot more. And those multiples, it could be that you bought something for 3 or 4 times or 5 times profit, but some of those practices had a little profit. So you might get a really good buy something for $500,000. And in 2, 3, 4 years, maybe that practice is worth 2 or 3 million. And so we talk a lot about, who wants to own a veterinary practice, and it's kind of like, oh, nobody wants to own these days. And I think that's shifted. VBMA groups, as you know, are quite strong, and as I think they've seen, the interest in practices and what some practices sell for, there's certainly a fair amount of people that are interested in ownership and management, and a lot of different models for doing that.
Yeah, I feel like that that little segment of you talking about just the opportunity set, it makes me think of, again, outside opinion, right? So you can be a veterinarian and you're going to save and you're going to invest and do all this other stuff, or you could take those funds, find a lender that is more than happy to lend into vet med because it's a very, great, reliable business from that standpoint. And you can take over a couple of years that $500,000 investment, and now it's worth several million. It's not everyone. It doesn't just happen. Like there's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears and stress and other things, right? Yes. And you know that more better than anyone, likely, how difficult that can be. But I mean, the magnitude of change that can have on a financial situation, that's where I go back to. And I've said this, many times on the podcast, where when I was told, hey, by my peers that I told my peers that I was going to focus on vet med, they're like, oh, there's no money in vet med and all this other stuff. And it's interesting as, I get more educated, entrenched, and have been around for a little while. It's like, that's not the case at all. And there's a lot of really interesting, like entrepreneurial minds in vet med. And it's not always practice ownership. Sometimes it's just developing products and other things for their peers, that the wealth creation in that is wild. And so that to me is another thing where it's like, you have a special skill set, lean into that and think of that investment in your education at vet school as part of kind of, paying the dues to then go and do these other things that, Isaiah without a DVM can go buy the S&P 500. It's like, that's not anything special. And you can try to save your way and invest your way to do it, but there's just so much opportunity, to your point, for younger, hungrier veterinarians to look at, hey, there's a lot of stuff and there's a lot of money. We walked around VMX. I know you were there as well. There's a lot of people there. There's a lot of money spent to bring, a lot of people in that space. So don't forget that. And the other piece that I'll kind of mention is, you talked about the real estate and the facility and all that. And I've heard that multiple times. So it's really interesting. And I've had on in the past, Rahul Chatterjee from Matthews, and I ran into him at VMX, and I think he had committed he's going to come back on the podcast at some point. So I'll make sure he does now that I've thrown his name out there again. But he had talked about just the amount of value in veterinary real estate X the practice, and just how much value creation has been there over the last handful of years. And there's some reasons for that we don't necessarily need to get into as well, but it's really interesting because you have to have, again, the nice facility, because it is tricky to recruit, retain talent, because there is something to be said for being able to operate in an area that is functional and you're not crammed in like sardines and on top of each other, because you know what, that's just going to add extra stress in a stressful environment anyways. You don't need that. So yeah, I really appreciate that. I think that's a great overview of kind of what the value threshold and kind of the exponential growth is.
One thing that I think is really significant. In one of my passions right now is taking your individual self, and you're your own, JR, in my case, LLC. You're your own business as a veterinarian. Obviously, a lot of times you are working for somebody, but the taking that time to do, and early on again, financial planning, career planning, I think is really significant because you can steer that ship in that right direction. And so, in my early days, I think because I was looking for specific things, as opportunities came up in terms of whether it's buying a practice or getting into writing and consulting and those type of things. I think, again, some of those outside forces, as opposed to just, doing the daily grind and not paying attention to your career for 5-10 years is a big mistake. And so in someone like your capacity that, has seen a lot of, different avenues that people have taken, that advice can be, really helpful. And I think people really need to know, hey, what am I, want to do? The veterinary degree, in a lot of ways, I don't want to compare it to a law degree, but it opens the doors to so many things that you can do. And so you can really enjoy the medicine intellectually and the practice. But boy, there's a lot of good opportunities.
Totally. Yeah, that's extremely well said. I have a lot of other questions, but I'm going to ask the question I ask all the guests. And I think I told you about this, and if I didn't, then I'm just going to catch you by surprise, right? So I always let anyone that comes on the show ask me a question, right? I think it's something that going back to the term earlier, swiped from another podcast I had listened to for a while that I liked, because sometimes the dialogue at the end of an episode was so interesting. I was like, yeah, the guest was great. It was interesting. But then the guest asked this question, and it like turned in this whole other thing. No pressure, right? Like the question can be silly. It can be off the wall. It can just be, hey, how was VMX? Blah, 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 whatever, right? But any questions that you would want to kind of pose to me and we can chat through or dissect?
Sure. And, it goes back to my saying a fresh set of eyes, because we think nobody, if you're not inside this profession, then you don't know anything about it. What are you seeing as the, I guess, really good opportunities coming up? And are you still as gung-ho on the profession as we, come out of COVID? And I would say things are, probably, a little bit slower. Did we I guess, estimate the potential of the profession, or how are you feeling about the folks that are going into the profession now?
Yeah, you talked about it earlier about there's a lot of different de novos. And one thing that's been interesting is we've had a number of clients that, were the quintessential, I'm going to buy into this practice. It didn't end up working out for a variety of reasons, so I'm going to go do my own thing. And just seeing, from here's the idea, here's the creation, and then just how quickly. And for some of them, it's been insane to see how quickly they've grown. Now, some of them are just like really special, smart folks, and like the credit is all them. And other times it's like, hey, they're really smart, but they also put themselves in a position to win by being in the right areas and doing their research and understanding what's the opportunity here. And I think there's just so much thought that is going into how to design a better experience for someone to walk in. And I think Peter Weinstein talked about this a long time ago, and I know he talks about it all the time. It's like you're competing with service revenue from all these other areas. And especially as we go into a recession, and if people have less money to spend, right, at some point, they're going to start saying no to things. And if the veterinary care and the experience that you provide, it is a service and it is an experience that you need to provide them, so that they say, you know what, when I need to pull back or cut back, it's not here, because this is extremely valuable for us as a family. It's important for my pet. Like, you can build those relationships and bonds. I think that's been the really cool thing. So no, I think veterinary medicine is poised, and I'm going to forget his name, but he's the CEO of JB Holdings. But he talked about there's the super cycle, the golden age of veterinary medicine, that had basically started, mid 2010s, right? And is a 50-year super cycle. I still believe that. I still fully believe that there's a really good opportunity. And what you talked about with it could be a rural, it could be a smaller, secondary or tertiary kind of metro area. finding that practice that's maybe less desirable from competing with, the big, consolidators or private equity money, you can go in as a young, hungry doctor and still make a really material impact. And we didn't necessarily, one of the questions and one of the areas I wanted to get into was kind of culture and thinking about that, which it's a whole other long kind of area to get into that maybe we can chat another time on it, because I think it'd be interesting. But if you're a younger doctor and you come in with, again, a fresh set of eyes and go at it a different way where you're committed to building up the team and investing, where maybe they didn't get as much love as they should have from the previous owner, like there's dramatic changes there. And when people know that you care and that you're showing up for them each and every day, it sounds super simple. It's hard, right? And it's simple, but it's not easy. So to me, there's still a wild, really good opportunity. And then same thing, like you can go to another corporate entity, have equity in that larger group of hospitals and do really well, work your way up, medical director. And if you want to get out of clinical medicine, there's plenty of really cool roles, as we've talked about, right, that you can put your skill set to work and still make a material impact on, patient care across lots of hospitals. Because you can only see, so many animals in one hospital setting. But if you're in charge of multiple, you can kind of dictate, how do we provide the best standard of care? And I think that's pretty cool. So it depends on what someone's trying to solve for and what they want from a lifestyle perspective. But you mentioned it earlier, like you have to know what you're solving for and be intentional, like putting your nose to the grindstone and working hard. Like there's a point that you need to do that. You have to do that. You have to put in the work, but you can't just say, I'm just going to grind forever and never like look up to say, what am I actually trying to get to? And so for me, I think one of the key things that we try to do in our conversations with clients is just like, what's the end result? What do you want it to look like? And it's like, just dream a little bit. It might not even be realistic today, but like, where do you actually want to go? So no intention or plans of saying, hey, that vet med idea, bad idea, I'm done with it, right? Like, I think it's a great profession. The people have been fantastic that I've been able to meet. And I think VMX even just kind of put a big stamp on that too, where I had so many good conversations that, sometimes it's a personal conversation with someone where it's like, wow, that's just a good human being. And so that's been really fun.
So you're not moving on to dentist yet?
No. So it's funny because like the dentistry thing was kind of my initial foray into vet med. And I'm almost at the point now where I've tried to kind of do both, but I can't be everywhere forever. And it's kind of like, that's really, in 2021 was less and less. In 2022, there really wasn't much at all that I was doing in dentistry. And so I started to kind of remove it more and more from social media stuff, just because I don't feel like I can devote the time and energy needed to do a job well there. So it's like vet med is the focus. And if you look at our team, it's like, we have 2 other DVMs that are working with their peers. It's like, that's the focus, right? It's not necessarily on dentistry. So yeah, oddly enough, it was kind of dropping dentistry for
thing out there.
But seriously,
moving beyond. But
but it started more dentistry, and then it came into vet med, and vet med to me has been the area where it's made more sense, and it's just been, I think whether it's the stories resonated, the content, the intent, I don't know. So yeah, vet med is really the focus. So that's kind of where I've decided to devote time, energy, and basically my career at this point. So
sure. Well, we appreciate it. We appreciate the fresh eyes, and also I think the focus on, making sure that veterinarians are successful, be it financially and just in terms of their work, as well as, a lot of focus on the folks that make up our team, which is, we're nothing without them. So we appreciate the attention.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your time. And to wrap up, for those that want to connect, reach out, learn more, like where would you send them? Is there anywhere you would encourage them to reach out?
Are you talking about for myself or?
Yep, for you. Yep.
Yeah. So I can share my email address, and I don't know if you want me to give that to you, or if you're just going to publish it out.
I can put it in the show notes. Are you on LinkedIn at all? I mean, are you
yes.
out and about? Okay. I was going to say, I can put that link in the show notes as well.
Yeah, but people are more than welcome to contact me by email, and always happy to have people share ideas or answer questions. Enjoy working with the students, so I do a lot with the DVMA groups as well. And yeah, it's a fun for me. It's just the evolution of the profession has been fascinating, and what we can give back to make sure that it's a good, profession going forward is important.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate the time. And I know there'll be a lot of good nuggets that people pull out of this conversation. So thank you.
Thanks. Well, thanks a lot for having me. It's enjoyable speaking with you today.
Thanks for listening to today's show. The comments made on today's show should not be taken as investment, tax, or legal advice. All comments are for educational purposes only. You should talk to your professional team before implementing anything. If you want or need financial advice, my day job on Not Podcasting is helping veterinarians grow their net worth. Our team is taking new clients, and we are ready to talk to you at any stage of life. Come as you are. I always say bring the mess, right? Like if things are unorganized, that's okay. There's no prerequisites to become a client. Isaiah Douglas is a partner at Vincier Wealth Management. Isaiah is a registered investment advisor, registered with the SEC. The biggest compliment you can give me in the podcast is to share it with a friend. Reviews help the show get found, and Apple Podcast is the platform that is predominantly used for people listening to the show. If you have 3 minutes, love the show, head over to Apple Podcasts, give us an honest rating and review. It helps more people find the show. Also, the new YouTube channel is up, and I'd love to have you subscribe. Vainly, I want 100 subscribers at least. Lots more, obviously, right? But I get a vanity URL if we get to 100. That would be great. It makes it easier to find the YouTube channel as well. For all of today's links, information, head over to the veterinariansuccesspodcast.com. There you can subscribe to your favorite podcasting platform. It'll be a link to that YouTube channel I just talked about. You won't miss any other episodes, whether you list on Spotify, whether you have some other ancillary podcast platform. Please like, subscribe, all that stuff. It certainly does help. I appreciate it. Finally, if you want more information, insights, want your voice to be heard, want to share ideas for content, say, hey, Isaiah, I want you to have this guest. I want you to talk about this topic. Go over to the Facebook group. So you can search for the Veterinarian Success Podcast on Facebook or head over to veterinariansuccesspodcast.com, scroll to the bottom about your host, click on the Facebook icon, and that'll get you in the group. But thank you so much for listening. It means a lot to me to be able to see the podcast grow and continue to impact people. So with that, until next time, we'll chat soon.